OSHA inspectors have read it. What is the most maddening or dumbest violation you've seen in a workplace? I used to work as a safety consultant for an insurance broker. One of our insureds had an employee who was tasked to apply a "Do not enter compactor starts automatically" sign on a cardboard box compactor. The idiot set the can of spray adhesive on the lip of the compactor, knocked it in, and then jumped in the compactor to get it. Of course, it started automatically because it's a machine that can't tell idiot from box. He's lucky someone else was walking by and saved his life. Story 2. I was on the Workplace Health and Safety Committee. The committee head at the time decided to change a light bulb. Do you think that she used a stepladder on the sloped surface? Nope. Office chair with wheels and nobody to hold it still. So many stupid decisions in that last sentence. Of course she fell, broke her arm, and received workplace compensation. The kicker? The light bulb wasn't blown. She was just using the wrong light switch. Story 3. Worked in a warehouse that repaired tools and equipment for erecting wind turbines. There was one beloved program manager that always met schedules early and under budget. All the execs loved him. But his equipment came back basically disassembled and reassembled with all the safety checks removed so they'd work faster. The way they rigged up the electrical equipment was downright scary. He'd hire unqualified lifting equipment inspectors for his work site instead of relying on the corporate guys who took their time and kept documentation on everything. Stuff like that. Cutting corners whenever he could. But he got everything done on time, so he was a golden goose. Every time I hear of an accident at a wind farm, I wonder if it's related to that guy. Story 4. Port State Inspector. For me and most of my colleagues, it's things relating to fire safety, particularly fire doors. The amount of time I've found auto-closing doors tied, wedged, weighted, or just fixed in the open position is maddening. Fire is the worst thing that can happen on a ship, and these doors have to be able to be closed at any time. But people are too damn lazy to open a goddamn door, so they tie them open. And then guess what? Time and time again, there is a fire, and when we do the investigation, assuming there is anything left to investigate, we find a fire door fixed open that's allowed to fire to spread. People in my industry literally die every year because some damn ab or assistant engineer is too lazy to open a door. So that's the most maddening. The dumbest would be when a captain tries to stop us from coming on board in the first place. FYI. If you're working in the marine industry, never try this. It will end badly for you. One of two things will happen. We will just refuse your ship access and blacklist you. Or we will allow you in and then immediately detain the ship. I remember one captain stood on the gangway and tried to block me and my boss from boarding. He said, "This is unreasonable. We have had no time to clean up or anything and demanding we come back after he had finished cargo operations." Hearty laughs were had, and we told him he had however long it was going to take us to walk back up to the harbor master station and walk back down with Royal Police escort, and that in the meantime, the ship was detained. Story 5. We received a complaint about workers using liquid nitrogen inside of a confined space. I went out to this sand and gravel company and saw this 30 feet long above-ground storage tank. There was a liquid nitrogen tank outside the opening and 2 workers outside. I showed my ID and discovered one of the workers outside was the foreman, and the other was monitoring the air quality for the workers. All good, right? Nope. The entrance was a small square opening at the end. There were about 4 workers inside the tank using liquid nitrogen to cool the tar in the tank so it could be chipped out. So they were introducing a gas which could displace oxygen. The person doing air monitoring had a probe only a couple feet long, so it was only really checking the air quality of the fresh air mixed with tank air, not the air in the workers' breathing zone. The workers were about 15 feet into the tank. They had no confined space training, no confined space permit, no rescue plan. The foreman then copped an attitude and told me I was wasting their time. I red-tagged the operation, normally reserved for only when voluntary immediate compliance seems unlikely, and told them it was illegal for them to continue work or re-enter the tank until they met the confined space rules. It was a pretty hefty fine. The company didn't appeal. I think the foreman got fired as management seemed unaware that the activity was taking place and was further upset at the foreman's reaction. Normally, sand and gravel companies in my area do a good job with health and safety. It was a rare miss for them. Story 6. Former safety rep who specialized in industrial food manufacturing working for the largest food companies. I am now in school for psychology, so I'm interning at a clinic. In my interview, I said that was my previous career, so they asked me to do their evacuation exit plans and evacuation schemes. Yet, they won't buy the fire extinguisher signs. The thing I repeatedly tell them to do is unlock one of the doors leading to an exit door. They have a storage, file room with one of the emergency exits, and you can't walk in the room even if the door is unlocked. Story 7. I taught skydivers to be tandem instructors. One drop zone bought a new type of tandem rig and faked their training. Management had them lie about it to me and another examiner. Chief instructor's excuse: they're all the same anyway. He had a malfunction caused by his not knowing how the rig worked, and his poor paying first-time passenger had no idea the danger this arrogant put him through. The worst thing was the training was free. Seriously, what the heck? Story 8. Worked in a hospital lab and higher-ranked coworker asked me to take inventory of things from our liquid nitrogen storage tank. Minus 200 degrees, mind you. I asked her for the proper mitts to handle our stuff, and she told me to just use our usual latex gloves. What the heck? My company rents the lab space of the hospital, so I'm assuming she doesn't know where it is and doesn't care to ask. I proceed to ask the hospital lab staff for proper mitts, to which I was given. After I took inventory, coworker decided she wanted to do a verification inventory check and had the audacity to ask me for the proper mitts. Story 9. I work as a fire safety and labor protection. At one of my sites, this particular one being a small, medium-sized shop, I was made aware of a hidden room. There's a narrow corridor to enter that they blocked off whenever they knew I was coming. No fire door, so any fire spreads straight onto the main shopping area. The room contains a plethora of 415-volt panels and is absolutely rammed with wood, cardboard boxes, and what felt like every combustible material possible, roughly 30 years worth of crap. Essentially, the mother of all fire hazards with enough immediate fuel and oxygen to burn down the building and neighboring stores. The maddening part of it was essentially all the staff at the shop were aware of it but did nothing to fix the issue and even actively worked to hide it. If you see a fire hazard, please fix it or report it. Also, the sole fire escape was jammed due to the door warping and would not open at all. Having not been checked in, I imagine the roughly 2 months since I was last on site. Story 10. Wasn't our plant, but another plant for our company. We have these huge steel drums that we fill with 100 pounds of ingredients that go onto an hydraulic lift that lifts and tilts the drum and pours the contents into a kettle. The drum shifts forward a little bit on the lift, while all the way up and falls back into place on its way down. The operator was resting his hand on the bottom of the lift while lowering it back down, and the drum fell back down on his finger, and he broke this finger. That's not the worst part. Afterwards, the safety lead was doing a review of the incident, and another operator showed the safety lead exactly what happened and broke his finger in the same manner. Story 11. I'm not a safety inspector, but this came to mind. I am an electrician in Las Vegas. One job site I was on was the remodel of the hotel tower at Caesar's Palace. We started at the bottom floor and worked our way up the tower, 1 floor a week for a year. It was horrible air conditions, major demolition, massive dust, because the hotel windows in Vegas don't open in order to keep people from jumping out. They rely on exhaust fans to circulate air, but don't run the fans for the subhuman construction workers like myself. Then after almost a year, coughing and gagging when we were on the very last floor, level 44, a team of men showed up in hazmat suits and shut the job down. Apparently, all of the sparkly dust we were breathing every day was almost entirely asbestos. Story 12. The safety committee at the state psych hospital I worked at was going building to building, making a surprise inspection, a hospital chapel, and found the chaplain sitting at his desk, getting a BJ by one of the patients who was under his desk. That old ducker should have gone to prison, but they let him take early retirement. Story 13? This one is a 2-for-1. I was doing a mock audit of a plant in my company, where I was just wandering around doing my own thing, when I noticed that there was an issue with a proofing tray that needed to be fixed. Bread dough needs to rest, and these trays rest the bread after mixing, but before forming. It's a long conveyor belt that snakes upwards, so the bread goes a long ways, but doesn't really go anywhere. Ours looked like that, but was more than twice as tall, more beefy, and had equipment under it. The standard procedure would be to stop the line and get a cherry picker in there to do the work. I know this because I wrote it. The problem is, the cherry pickers are across the plant in the warehouse, are slow and hard to maneuver into place because this was in between 2 lines about 15 feet apart from each other with pipe work and cables running between them at 10 pounds. Instead, the maintenance guy climbs up the side of the machine and shimmies along the edge of the proofer so he's 20 feet in the air untethered and above the product line. He takes his free hand and wrenches on stuff. Gives a thumbs up to the operator to start the line again so he can watch these gears turning inches from his hands that are holding him up. I take a few pictures and start sending people to break. I stop the line, call the lead over, and motion for the maintenance guy to come down. I don't have my radio because the real secret part of these audits are that I'm avoiding work. Because he was working above the product line and didn't follow procedure, we had to stop and clean the line, throwing out around 7,000 pounds of bread dough because we had to take it out of the mixers, off the line, out of the proofers. We had to do this because bread dough, especially our recipes, have a short time of being manageable before they grow too big and won't work anymore. Because this would take longer than that small window, and we couldn't stop mixing in all but one machine that had only dumped the dry ingredients, we had to toss it all. The reason is that in food safety, the floor is poison, and there is no 5-second rule. Once it touches the floor, it is dead to you, and either needs to be tossed or cleaned by sanitation. If it's red, certain parts of it can touch the floor, but after touching a red-colored item, you need to wash your hands before touching anything else. Shoes count as part of the floor. Anything your shoe touches is subjected to same treatment as the floor. Because this guy climbed above the product line and started monkeying with stuff everywhere his boots touched or where above had to be cleaned. No getting around it. We had to take out all the proofing trays because we couldn't tell which ones was underneath his shoes and wash the belt under the proofer. This didn't go over well with anyone because they just did this as part of weekly cleaning 2 days ago and it takes 6 hours. Lots of people asked why I didn't stop him and I replied, I'm here to observe, not to interact. If I wasn't here, what would have happened? Either way, it didn't matter because everyone had a dotted line to me, so they had to do what I said. And my boss just asked, why didn't he get the picker, which would have taken 20 minutes instead of hours? And he got in trouble with the safety committee as he was not tethered for when he has to climb on the proofer. Story 14. A powder-actuated hammer is a gun that fires nails into steel using gunpowder. I once had to prevent someone from looking down the barrel of one when it jammed. Tons of fun around demolition crews, too. Like preventing them from demoing the parts of the building, holding up the area they're standing on, commonly mistaking the live wires for the clearly marked out disabled wires, or constantly starting fires. When you need to work out some stress, usually they don't mind lending you a sledgehammer to go work out your frustrations on. Anything to do with traffic around cities is a damn nightmare. Give sympathy to the flaggers. They deserve a lot. Story 15. I've worked for a couple of engineering contractors in the past. My first firm was by far the worst for lack of work ethic and sheer incompetence. OSHA would have a field day with them. One time, our reciprocating saw broke. The foot that held the blade in place was busted, so rather than follow protocol and get another saw, my coworker fastened the blade in place with a plastic wire tie and proceeded to use it. The same firm worked as contractors for the company my dad worked for, so he has the best, worst stories about them. On one site, they'd found that sections of a pipeline had been sealed with asbestos gaskets. The boss of my firm, I'll call him Jim, was present on this site and had to call in a specialist to remove the asbestos. Jim would never wear safety gear like the other guys, claiming to be exempt. And so when the specialist turned up in full breathing gear and overalls and tried to do his job, Jim just stood leaning on the pipe in his normal clothes talking to him. My dad and the others are stood well away from the asbestos at this point, and he shouts out, Jim! What? Are you immune? Immune to what? Damn asbestos! I've breathed loads of it in the power stations. It's all political. My dad says that Jim has defied all facets of medical science by staying alive this long. Story 16. I worked in a lab doing cytomegalovirus research. One day we had workers in replacing the lights and one said, wow, I always thought those shower things were real, pointing at one of the emergency showers in the lab. These are for heavy-duty chemical spills, where you run under the shower and pull a handle to decontaminate. Turns out ours were just the shower heads in the ceiling, not connected to any water. We used extremely dangerous chemicals every day. We got the showers hooked up pretty quickly after that. Story 17. I actually am an OSHA inspector, but I work for a state that has their own state OSHA plan. Same as federal OSHA, but a little more strict. I can almost guarantee you that if you work construction in my state, you have seen us or we have seen you. My office alone, which is just one county, has over 40 compliance officers. Yes, a lot of people hate us, and yes, there are some bad compliance officers, just like there are some bad police officers. When we come on site, we would love nothing more than to find 0 violations. The amount of paperwork we have to do is astronomical. We have to treat every case as if it is going to court, even though maybe only 2 precinct do. People passed away at work every day from very preventable reasons. Yes, sometimes injuries and deaths are caused by employees not following company rules or taking shortcuts. But statistics also show that the companies with very good safety programs have lower accident rates and are typically very profitable. As for worst violation that I have seen, I investigated a multiple death incident at a company. An employee entered a permit-required confined space without utilizing the proper precautions. The employee became unconscious due to the inert gases that were not properly purged from the space. Another employee walks by, sees the unconscious employee, tries to rescue him. That employee then became unconscious. Then again with another employee. Now they have 3 unconscious employees who eventually passed away from lack of oxygen. After the investigation, the company had no written confined space policy or rescue procedures. We found out after performing employee interviews that they were told to hold their breath while they performed work in the space because they were only checking a gauge, and it would only take like 30 seconds. After about $500,000 in fines and the owner actually going to jail for 5 months, the company went out of business. And the worst part is a fire department was located across the street, and they were trained in confined space rescue. Story 18. My dad works on a large renovation project for a national landmark. He identified a hazard where workers putting up scaffolding would have to walk along the sloped incline of a plateau that functioned as the foundation for a construction shack, all the while carrying the scaffolding components. They didn't have to walk up the hill or down the hill, but along the entire width of the slope base. This is a hazard since workers had no form of handrails, other support, and could easily twist their ankles or lose their balance. He notified the foreman about this in the morning. He didn't think it a problem. He notified the site manager of this in response, but he was in meetings all morning. That afternoon, he spots a group of 3 guys walking on the construction site. Shorts, sandals, and no helmets. He walks up to them. "So, gents, what are we doing? You need steel-toed boots and helmets, right?" "Yes, sir, but we're just leaving and heading home. We all twisted our ankles and can't continue working." Sure enough, all of them had SCD, bruised knees and shins. That were the workers putting up the scaffolding, every single one of them. Half an hour later, the foreman comes walking over to him. "What the heck do you think you're doing going over my head like that? I've got a schedule to finish here. Those scaffolds need to be up by tomorrow and wired by the end of the week. I don't have time for this." "I don't know if you've noticed, but all the workers for the scaffolding have gone home injured. And now, since they can't finish the scaffolding, the electricians can't start on the wiring the day after tomorrow, and the whole project is looking at a 2 weeks delay at least." Story 19. I didn't see it personally, but someone smoking and another person eating lunch inside of what was a high-risk containment during an asbestos abatement. In a high-risk, you have to be naked under your bodysuits, shower when you leave, cannot bring anything in or out that hasn't been washed, and you have to wear a full face mask. It's supposed to be very sterile. These guys had their face masks off inside the containment eating and smoking. Story 20. I do environmental compliance, specifically air pollution control. One day, we received a complaint from a former employee of a company about a whole laundry list of stuff his former employer was doing wrong. That's not super unusual. People get fired or quit on bad terms and call basically every agency they can think of for payback. Anyway, we responded. When we got there were a few things that weren't right, but the icing on the cake was that they had this pollution control device that was supposed to be collecting dust from one of their processes. One problem, though, all of the dust was on the ground around it. We told them in no uncertain terms that it was unacceptable and that they needed to clean it up immediately. We also told them we would be back to make sure they did. A couple weeks later, we scheduled a visit. I cannot stress enough that this time they knew we were coming. Guess what we saw on our return? Dust all over the ground. The kicker is, they had this broom and shovel out there the first time, and it was still there the second time, just leaning on the wall like 3 feet from where it was the first time. For those keeping track, that means they either A, never cleaned up the dust, or B, that they cleaned up the dust and subsequently spilled more, but either way, someone had to go out there and move the shovel. So despite us telling them that they could not do this and that we were going to come back and make sure it was corrected, they went ahead and did actual nothing to improve the situation. I've got tons of stories like this one. People do some really dumb stuff and then get mad when the notice of violation shows up in the mail. Story 21. I have many years doing safety inspections. I have seen some fun things in my time. I have seen industrial fans' cords spliced onto an extension cord with the bare wires exposed and charred, and the employer saying it's fine because it still worked. An owner of a nursing home reached into a used and full sharps container to prove that needles were not being recapped. A guy outside of a window on a 3rd story of a house on the edge of a board removing a window pane without any fall protection, while his 2 buddies are inside on the other side of the board holding him up. There is a level of trust that I do not have with most folks. Walking up to a house, and the owners had made a makeshift driveway out of asbestos siding that they had removed from the building the previous day, and seeing kids playing in the area. A compressed gas cylinder filling station would receive old cylinders, and they would have to empty them prior to repairing or destroying them. The guy doing this would take them out back and, while holding his breath, would secure them and open up the valves to empty them and then go inside. This worked okay for a while until it didn't, and he got dosed with a massive exposure to arsine gas. The company usually didn't deal with this gas, but had received from one of their customers for disposal, which almost caused complete renal failure. These are just a few that I can recall that kind of stuck with me. There are lots and lots of run-of-the-mill safety issues that I see all the time, but the majority of the time it's ignorance of the law and not malice for most employers. Story 22. Oh, I can tell you lots of stories. I do manufacturing safety now, but was in petroleum before primarily construction. One was in a DCP midstream plant in Hobbs, NM, about 50 feet away from a guy joyriding on a forklift who slammed his boom into an overhead pipe, popped a wheelie, and ended up with the boom between that pipe and another one. When we traced back the pipe he had nearly caused to burst, we found it was a 600 psi fuel gas line. The whole plant would have gone boom. 2, on the same DCP midstream project, was working a hydrogen sulfide disposal well across the street where they were replacing the casing. The well was 35% H2S. 1,000 parts per million will damn kill you in a single breath. And they didn't want to wear respirators or evacuate. and let us check the area under supplied air when alarms went off. We finally told them we were walking off the job if they didn't straighten their act out. Safety personnel legally had to be there, and we were the only provider in the area. 3. At my current employer, our CDL driver was backing a trailer up to a dock door at the warehouse and got out to go inside and make sure he was lined up correctly. He didn't set the brakes on the truck, though, and it proceeded to roll freely through the parking lot, wiping out people's cars. 4. Just recently had 2 forklift repair technicians use one forklift to pick up another forklift by its overhead guard and then stand under it to do a repair. Story 23. Got called to a factory where the workers had to cut metal on large conveyor belts. There were large boxes with built-in gloves that you stuck your hands in to operate the press. So for safety, workers had on one set of gloves that everyone wore on the factory floor because sharp, hot metal, and then stuck their hands in a second pair attached to the belts to reach the materials. One of the workers felt like this slowed him down, so he cut a hole in the safety box to be able to just reach in and adjust the metal to the press. Except, the press came down on his hand, leaving 4 of his fingers perfectly preserved inside the glove. They recovered his wedding ring, neatly dangling right above the cut-off finger bone. Story 24. This will seem trivial and trifling, but bear with me. I was the safety manager for a metal bashing company. The shop floor had designated walkways where safety shoes didn't need to be worn, but if you went off those walkways, you needed to be wearing your safety shoes. I lost count of the number of times I would be on the factory floor and see people from the offices wander into a welder's bay or the manufacturing shop in non-safety shoes. The main culprits tended to be salespeople, but I more than once witnessed the managing director do it. The problem is, as any safety manager, OSHA professional reading this will tell you, what appear to be trivial safety rules are there for a reason. If you get one part of the company going, yeah, but those rules don't apply to me, especially if those people are top management, it becomes hard to set a culture for the company. Story 25. Can I provide a reverse response to this question as an electrical engineer and an OSHA star electrical engineer at a research center? What is the most maddening, dumbest violation that was issued to us by safety, OSHA inspectors? My lab had a benchtop demo setup, which used our novel micro-switching circuit board to control power across a grid of light bulbs. Just your standard 60W glass light bulbs, which we'd turn on and off to show the different configurations in which our circuit could control power. Was a nice visualization. We had all the high voltage signage in place, no exposed voltages, plexiglass barriers to keep hands out of the circuitry and the light bulbs. When OSHA came and audited the lab, they asked me, "Are those the special safety light bulbs, which have a green tape inner lining to catch the glass pieces if they break?" They were not. So we got a finding written up for our lab. My manager gave me a hard time about it and assigned me the task to find those special safety bulbs and replace the normal ones ASAP. Turns out those safety bulbs aren't very common at all. After some digging, I found a company that sold them, and I'll never forget the item description on their website. Safety-lined glass bulbs, great for nurseries, daycares, grade schools, etc. Add professional research facilities to the list. Story 26. I have so many I can barely choose. Once I noticed workers welding on a table with their leathers between their waist and the table. Apparently, bad wiring in the building was causing the full outlet electrical current to charge the table when the machines were set up. So for years, people just knew not to touch anything near or on the table during welding work. Once I couldn't stop a place from not welding outside next to their flammable cylinders. A manager was having an employee scale lime deposits off equipment with essentially CR and letting it just run free into the storm drain next to him. It literally dyed the pavement for over a year. Had 2 gits try to get something off a wall in a warehouse. One held the base of a ladder, standard, not a frame, while the other got to the top rung and started jumping to reach whatever it was. I shouted to them, and the git holding the base turned to look at me and let go. As you can imagine, Git 2 had a quick trip back to the ground. Story 27. This is coming from my stepbrother. He managed a warehouse that had industrial-sized rolls of aluminum and other metals. These rolls weighed multiple tons each. They would use an automated crane. They would program each space available, and the crane would place the rolls where they were delegated. My brother tells me about an employee that knew how to work the system with FMLA. This guy was lazy and knew how to get away with it. It turns out he programmed a slot on the top of a stack to be a dead zone. No rolls would go to that one spot. He set up a makeshift bed and would crawl up and take naps. He kept this secret, obviously. If someone had seen this spot was unused and reprogrammed it, the automated crane would have placed a 4-ton roll on top of him while he slept. Some people are wild. Story 28. Not the OSHA guy, but it happened in the plant I was working in. Idiot is told by junior manager to clean the floor after a chemical spill. I don't recall what it was for certain, but we used a lot of industrial adhesives, so maybe that. Idiot ignores all his safety training and the entire closet full of cleaning gear and decides to clean the spill with acetone. and a steel wire brush. It wasn't so much of an explosion as a deep whoomph sound that sucked most of the air out of the room. He was horribly burned. Third-degree burns. Incredibly, he was still alive when the fire and paramedics got there. He opened his eyes, asked for a cigarette, and passed away right there on the floor. What did we do? Hosed down the floor, and the line was back up by that afternoon. Quit that job as soon as I was able. Story 29. I'm as a watchman at my workplace. I recently had management trying to pin a couple of guys on my shift for putting a pallet of product close to a fire hose. Okay, fair, yeah, it's a safety issue. Only problem was more than half of the fire hoses on site are blocked or inaccessible due to rows of product blocking them. Poor storage planning on management's behalf. Yet, one pallet near a fire hose is enough cause for a written warning and talks of terminating said employees. Safe to say, when I politely pointed out how many safety hazards and violations that were the fault of the management, they quickly dropped their talks of terminating employees. Still working on getting those other fire hoses unblocked, though. Like banging your head on a brick wall, sometimes I swear. Story 30. Worked as a store man at a retail store. We were having renovations done to the building at the time, so there were a lot of construction workers around. One day I walked in on a bunch of Eastern European workers holding a ladder on top of a trolley while one of them climbed it to reach something on the wall. High ceiling. I flipped my crap at them and had a go at their foreman as well. Story 31. The ones that make me maddest are the blatant health violations. Mica dust everywhere. No respirators, no exposure assessments, no awareness among anyone at the location of the hazards of mica dust. When asking the ACE folks at the site about it, they just didn't know at all. And I was like, it's your responsibility to know this stuff. I also audited a site that uses very dangerous pharmaceutical compounds, but had nothing in terms of exposure assessments. They just put it all in a glove box and assumed it was okay. The twist, they had not done any sort of testing on the glove box or training on cleaning or validation that the box was actually airtight. There is zero excuse to have no program in place, and employees were symptomatic. Their IT professional was a CIH with a lot of experience, so it's not like he didn't know he had to do that stuff. He just hadn't done it. Story 32. I had an employee using a hydraulic shear, 10 tons of cutting force, to downsize very hard metals. He got to a piece that was larger than the guard would allow so. Of course, he removed it. He went back to sizing the metal of normal thickness. The position of the machine was an L, so his left hand would move the material, then actuate the machine with his right. The machine had a dead man's switch, so if the handle was released, the hold in the shear would pop back up. Long story short, he lost his thumb off with 10 tons of force. Story 33. A company I worked for a while back had recently bought a facility that had been a different type of factory, but was closed for a few years. As they were refurbishing the building, utilities, etc., the company's safety manager came by to visit and do a walkthrough. He was in the office with the plant manager while contractors as well as company maintenance workers were working above the office area, which had a drop ceiling and not much else overhead. One of said maintenance workers' contractors dropped a piece of conduit. It passed cleanly through the drop ceiling and hit the safety manager, who was wearing steel-toed safety boots, on the side of the foot, instantly lost the pinky toe on his foot. I think it was the only OSHA recordable incident for the year at that plant, and it was the safety manager who got injured. Everyone called him Johnny Nine Toes after that. He was not amused. Story 34. Safety inspector for an engineering service company. The amount of basic duck-ups when any floor staff tried rigging equipment to be lifted is too damn high. These people have had the correct training, but seem to think getting it done quicker is a lot better than getting it done safely. Story 35. My old workplace had all the fire extinguishers removed in an offset printing place, full of flammable dust and paper. I was only working there a couple months, but they got fined for that crap and finally actually remounted the extinguishers. Story 36. I managed safety for a medium-sized company in the United Kingdom. Best one to date was where I received a phone call informing me a supervisor on the factory floor had damaged their hand in a razor-sharp guillotine. This is an automatic guillotine, which cuts material to specified lengths at approximately 5-second intervals. I turned up to find the supervisor's hand wrapped in a cloth, which had now turned red due to the large amounts of blood. Turns out that some material became stuck in the guillotine, preventing the blade from cutting properly. The supervisor, without isolating the machine, tried to beat the 5-second count and free the obstruction, but the guillotine hit right through the palm of his hand. Turns out the blade just missed one of the main arteries in his hand, so he was extremely lucky. Story 37. My dad went to his workos committee to ask them to mow the patch between the parking lot and the building because the grass had gotten so long that snakes were living in it. The committee decided it was too risky to have someone mow it because there were snakes in the grass, and the person mowing might get injured. Story 38. I used to work as a baker. My old boss would screw with the inspection every time. Like 25 kilogram is the max weight you can lift, or 12 kilogram one-handed. So bags of flour weigh 25 kilogram, but the bag it's in weighs another 200 grams. The faces they made when they asked, Do you lift more than 25 kilogram regularly? Yes. Yes, we do. He had all sorts of these jokes. It was also an old bakery, so newer rules didn't always apply, which my boss used to the fullest as well. Story 39. Guy was a warehouse worker, qualified to use the forklifts, but this was a special one where the entire cabin lifts up so the forklift worker has better vision. What does the guy do? He gets out 3.5 meters in the air and steps on the pallet to adjust some of the products. The guy faced zero repercussions. He was a nice guy, but crazy. Story 40. I'm not even an inspector nowhere near, but once in culinary class we took a trip to our school cafeteria. I'm still in high school, by the way, because my teacher wanted to show us cleanliness. Well, foolish of her, she took us straight there. No warning or heads up to the lunch ladies, and it was filthy. I'm talking roaches everywhere, rat crap on the floor, unknown to us liquids on the floor, and then picking their ears and eating the earwax and going right back to prepping food that would be eaten an hour later by kids. The reason the only thing I eat are peanut butter and jams because they're in packages and a juice on the side. Story 41. I worked at a restaurant. I was in the office after hours with 2 electricians. They were doing work on the breaker box. This thing was huge, like 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. These 2 were trying to put the cover back on and having a real hard time. Next thing I see a bright flash and the power is out. One of them picked up a Coke 2 bottle and bashed the panel to line it up and lights out. Everyone was okay, but I went and sat outside after that. Story 42. OSHA related. I was kicked off a job site by OSHA for parking in a driveway. I was also fined for not wearing a hard hat while installing carpet in a completely finished home in a residential neighborhood. Story 43. We just had a guy fall on Friday. He had been complaining about the ladders used for CIP, that they were too small, didn't hold enough weight, and some were busted. Been complaining for 6 months in every safety evaluation and safety meeting. Dude was taken out in an ambulance. I hope he's all right, but I also hope he sues. They don't give a duck about us here. Story 44. I seen 2 Spanish lads grinding a 12-inch pipe shed 80 moly pipe. Only they had no clamp, so one held it at face level. And they had no glasses or face guards. So they were both desperately looking away to avoid sparks in the eyes. Story 45. I once worked for a family-owned company that built towboats and barges. When I asked my friend boss, who got me the job, about mesothelioma and why it was so prevalent in the industry, he told me, I've been instructed by our lawyer not to answer that question, not to mention all of the other things I was told to overlook when I became part of management. Story 46. I noticed someone on the CCTV cameras riding around in a hoverboard while moving a wheelbarrow and was actually impressed until he knocked someone over outside in the pavement. We called him Dangerous Roy, and he broke 3 ribs by jumping onto a rock, slipping and falling onto the cement mixer's handlebars. We nearly had to report it to Ritter, but he left because the pay wasn't good enough. Was not mad at all. Story 47. I do code enforcement and inspections for my town, and recently I received a call about someone keeping livestock on their property as pets. This is not the first time, so I thought it was like 1 chicken. I drove to the house, and in the backyard they had built a home for about 11 chickens and kept a potbelly pig as a pet that lives in the house and backyard. I was speechless. Story 48. I was a co-chair of a health and safety committee for a small company of about 30 people. A couple of employees were asked to wash the overhead warehouse bay doors. We have a long attachment for a pressure washer for this sort of thing. Instead, they decided that one person would lift the other person up, standing on a pallet with a forklift. Not only that, but he tied a rope around his waist and the pallet as his safety harness. Story 49. My dad used to install heavy machinery in factories. One of the final tests was to make sure the machinery was hooked up to the kill switch. That's supposed to shut down the line. More than once, the only thing the switch would kill was the new piece of equipment, not the rest of the line, which is what the regs require. I just hope no one in those factories ever needed that kill switch. Story 50. Fire inspector here, finding a guy using a propane grill inside a building. He was initially pissed off when I told him he couldn't do that, until I showed him the stratified smoke that was about a foot off the ceiling. Story 51. I wasn't an HR officer, but I worked in HR. I once had a work-over claim come through my desk for an employee who broke their arm pulling a plant out the ground. Story 52. This one isn't the worst, but did happen over the weekend. Equipment operator used brake cleaner to remove grease from his hands and arms, then proceeded to light up a cigarette on his way out of the work area. Fairly significant second-degree burns on both hands and forearms. Story 53. Guy at my work was collecting a soil sample, tested it. Right after he finishes, the boss says, "Now can you test it all for asbestos when it's been exposed to what he thought was just plain soil for the past few hours?" Story 54. Carrying out warehouse check on a warehouse with one of our affiliated companies. I'm walking in the pedestrian-only marked walkway in my high-vis, etc., only to be nearly taken out by some guy not looking where he was going on a powered pallet truck going over the pedestrian-only areas. Like, what the heck, guy? How did you not see me? Story 55. My uncle is a safety inspector and is always going off about JEETs in the workplace. Same uncle broke his arm in 4 places trying to clean the gutters of his workplace with a too-short ladder on top of an oversized toolbox in wet weather. Story 56. Employee, with no competency, stole a telehandler. He then proceeded to drive into a fence. When questioned regarding this action, he answered that he was too lazy to walk to the canteen, 400 meters away from the work area. OSHA employees of Reddit, what is the biggest safety violation you have seen in a workplace? Story 1. In college, I took an OSHA certification course, and my instructor, who was an OSHA inspector, shared this story. My instructor was inspecting a lumber mill in northern Maine, walking around the facility. Employees told him to be careful around 2 large milling machines in the back of the mill. Every 10 seconds, like clockwork, a giant high-voltage charge would jump between both machines, arcing over the walkway path. Apparently, all of the employees knew about it and just carefully timed when they would walk through. That, he said, was the most glaringly obvious violation he's ever seen. Ever. Reminds me of the guillotines in Prince of Persia. Story 2. I am not an OSHA employee, but have seen numerous workplaces with some possible fire safety violations, like a locked fire exit door, people blocking ground floor windows with shelves, stuff like that. Story 3. I interned at OSHA. I got to ride around with a former electrical union superintendent, and I'm still telling stories. As an intern, they honestly let me ask anything. The inspectors were so glad that someone actually respected them and wanted to learn, so they just spilled. Personally, the worst was a couple dozen guys hung their coats up to cover the hot, commercial electrical box they had pigtailed their broken radio directly to. The OSHA inspector saw it and just turned to them and said, "Do you have a family? Do you ever want to see them again?" Turned out the crew chief had a brand new baby girl at home. He basically cried his face off about how stupid they were and shut it down until they could make it safer. No fines were issued, even though it could have bankrupted all 3 companies on site. Just real talk. In case you didn't know, that amount of electricity would kill you in the worst way, unable to let go and feeling every single shock and leave you a pile of dust. Story 4. I was the safety officer at a few workplaces. I had a bunch of rescue qualifications. The rule was this: protest the bad thing in writing. After that, it's not your problem. The boss will break any law he sees fit, and if something goes wrong, you told him so, and it's not your fault. Some businesses actually care about getting sued, and the safety officer is king. The companies I worked for cared about daily costs, and that was all. I was often asked to do things, as I was also a worker, that contravened occupational health and safety, and I would refuse, but I would never stop anyone else from doing it. I was never given that authority. Managers like to keep all the activity to themselves, even if they don't know what they're doing and they just want it done. They don't care how. I was once asked to move 40-kilogram loads on a regular basis. I refused as it exceeded the legal limit and I didn't want to hurt my back. I suggested the person telling me to do it should do it that way if they wanted. They apparently couldn't as they had hurt their back. Strange coincidence, yeah? Different guy wanted me to store a 20-kilogram box at full reach from a ladder. I refused, as it was unsafe. He put it up there himself. Cue 2 days later, when the box broke, as it was being retrieved and destroyed the expensive contents. On another occasion, I was busy with something and someone wanted to use the forklift to shift a drum of oil. I was the driver, but we had one of those walk-behind models with a steering handle which you are allowed to use without a license. I announced that I would be a couple of minutes and they simply went to collect the drum pincer, a special tool for picking up drums that is awkward and heavy. I would be there shortly. No, they are in a rush. They'll just do it themselves. Okay, I think. Saves me the effort. Suddenly, I hear telling and commotion. This is never good. I run out and they have pierced the drum with a tine. What's more, they have removed the tine from the hole and the drum has fallen over. Cue me on safety mode, yelling at everyone and rolling out the super expensive spill kit. 2 hours later, and it was decided nobody was at fault as it was the boss who did it. And since he couldn't blame anyone, nobody was to blame. That place was a hotbed of malicious compliance. Always had to get it on writing, though. Story 5. International gas plants, construction and operations. Once my idiot Chinese customers decided to ignore a massive leak in a sour gas line that was like 200,000 ppm of H2S. I was infuriated and fled site, and only then were they willing to shut it down, waiting to kill off the control room and poison the nearby town. This was by far the most dangerous thing I've seen. Confined space entry without an attendant. Yeah, that was stupid. And of course, this is the time it catches on fire. Luckily, we're able to escape. Hey, let's dump sour water into an open drain equal sign, slowly forming cloud of poison gas. Online unplugging. In one case, this guy waits for the bottom of a vessel to plug. He has a drain the same diameter as the vessel discharge pipe. So when it plug, he blocks off the discharge valves, opens the drain, and eventually the pressure builds up and a hunk of solids flies out from a 300 pounds per square inch, followed by a corrosive solvent, which they'll quickly block, but not before getting it all over their boots. Story 6. I work in an office and was voluntold to join our OSHA committee as I have my occupational first aid level 2. I hate that it costs me an hour a week. We have these meetings where we talk about boxes being piled too high, patches of carpet that are slightly peeled up, cords in meeting rooms that could be tripping hazards. But I could live with that. What bores to the soul of me and makes me want to storm out of these meetings is the discussions around reminders we should send out to all staff. Our staff are adults, and they work entirely inside. They don't need to be told it's almost summer. Remember to wear sunscreen when outdoors, or the weather is changing, make sure you have winter-appropriate tires on your vehicle. Plus, I have responded to a few emergencies and normal crap that I ask be posted isn't done. People don't call 911. People are idiots in emergencies. We had a woman have a stroke, and they called our first aid line. I was up from my desk and the other 2 attendants were off. Someone found me in the meeting and came to get me. A woman was delirious to a state of quasi-consciousness, unable to move, unresponsive. No one called 911, they called frigging me? I have a kit with some band-aids. Anyway, I got there, called 911, took her vitals, and it turned out she had had a stroke. Another instance, a woman had passed out in the women's bathroom, hit her head, and had been unconscious. Again, no one called 911. So I get there and it was just a low blood sugar, had skipped breakfast bikes to work, felt dizzy so went to the washroom to take a break, passed out, hit head. But damn, just call 911. So anyway, I have asked a bunch of times that we put out a note that the first thing to do for any medical emergency is call 911, but it hasn't happened. Story 7. Not OSHA, as I'm not in the United States, but part of my job involves working in confined spaces, accessing cabling, ducting, and risers, etc. There's a craton of confined spaces working regulations in this country that have to be met when working in spaces such as these. The work we do is classed as very low-risk confined space, but a friend of mine works at a chemical processing plant and sometimes has to enter empty chemical holding tanks or pressure vessels to clean out sediment and other contaminants by hand. Obviously, these are classed as massively high risk. There was an incident a few years back at his place when a new management team took over, and the cleanup crews were ordered to go in and clean out an unknown sediment layer without proper breathing apparatus. They had air-fed fume hoods, but these were nowhere near sufficient protection. Previously, they would bring a specialist contract company on site, who had all the necessary bay gear and training to carry out the work safely, but the new management didn't want to spend the money. The union got involved, and there was threats of the company being reported to the United Kingdom equivalent of OSHA for endangering life. Weirdly, though, according to one of the big contractors I was speaking to, previously mentioned that it's usually the confined spaces classified as low risk that are the biggest killers. Apparently, when it's an obvious high-risk situation or when nasty chemicals are involved, you're more inclined to treat it with caution. Yet, it's in a seemingly harmless space that stuff tends to go wrong. Apparently, what usually happens is Person A enters an unknown space without a risk assessment or the proper protective equipment, passes out. Person B enters the space to try to retrieve Person A, passes out. If they're lucky, Person C calls the fire service, and once they arrive on site and suit up, enter the space to retrieve 2 bodies. If they're unlucky, there is no Person AC. Story 8. Just like real-life OSHA, thankfully hasn't bothered to show up and chastise us for the crafty work we've done here. Obligatory, I don't work for OSHA. I recently walked onto my job site to see 2 of my GC's subs. They had stacked 3 ladders in a pyramid with the highest ladder, all 12, resting on the top rung of the other 2 ladders. First off, know that from an OSHA standpoint, if you're standing on the top rung of a ladder, you've already ducked up. These 2 idiots were using the most dangerous part of 2 separate ladders to support a 3rd ladder. Now, imagine with me, Idiot 1 is on the very top rung of this mecha ladder while Idiot 2 is supporting him by holding one of the lower ladders steady. My yawp of concern nearly knocked Idiot 1 to his well-deserved demise. I explained to them quickly why they were idiots and how to stop being idiots as soon as possible. Luckily, they were only tasked with running low-voltage Cat6 cable. Had they been running actual conduit, I'm sure they would have managed to lose their lives and burn down the building in the 2 hours it took me to get there in the morning. Story 9. Obligatory, not an OSHA employee preface. I work in pharmaceutical manufacturing, and we occasionally get OSHA investigators to give safety trainings. One trainer, Rep in particular, had been assigned to a case in Texas where a natural gas refinery exploded because a perfect storm of miscommunication, failed safety checks, and employees not following their SOPs. Opaque sight glass that needs to be clear to detect levels. Pressure gauges out of calibration, broken overfill alarms, among other safety violations. Story 10? I'm going to tell on myself here. Back in 2008, I was working for a major oil, gas company. I was a technician for open and cased hole tools. These are instruments that range in size from an inch or 2 to 8 inches in diameter and 3 feet long up to 14-ish. I don't remember what tool exactly we were working on, but it was definitely open hole and had been neglected for a while. To take them apart requires clamping them down in a pipe or chain vise, and using a 48 pipe wrench to remove the ends and access the internal electronics. This particular tool was stuck pretty good. We had tried hammering around the threaded area to shock the threads loose. Heating it up didn't work, so we took it out to the big shop where they had a much larger, heavier table to work on tools. We put the tool in the vise and tried a 48 pipe wrench to break it. Put a cheater on it, nothing. So we got a sling and trolleyed over the overhead 10-ton crane hoist. We bit the pipe wrench on the tool so it would get pulled up to loosen it, slapped the sling on the end of the 48 pipe wrench and the other end of the sling into the crane hook. We gave it a bump and the table started to lift. Damn. So we got a heavy-duty forklift, brought it over and set the forks on top of the table. At this point, the manager walked out of his office, looked at everyone and said, "I probably shouldn't be here." He turned around and walked back into his office. We gave the crane another bump and it finally broke the tool apart. Story 11. Not an OSHA employee. 1960, small town stamping plant an hour's drive from Detroit. Management was adjusting the line and wanted to move a medium stamping press mold size 3 by 3 feet a short distance. Largest forklift propane engine. Put the fork against the base and tried to shove the press over. Wheel slip. They raised the fork slightly to rest against a protrusion and tried to apply lift with the push. The rear of the forklift raised off the ground. Now they bring over a second forklift and stick its fork into the back of the first forklift where the toe pin cavity is. The second driver applies force while the first driver applies force and lift. The back end of the first forklift stays down. However, now the fork on the first forklift is deflecting, maybe a foot. At this point, I turn and leave for another building, hoping to escape shrapnel. They wound up renting a monster forklift to move that press. I'm not innocent. I used to stand on the forks and have the driver lift me 2 stories to reach the bus bar to change fuses for the presses. You can't lean on the channels because they are sliding as you are going up. As you approach the ceiling, the channels are at their stops and you can't reach them. You just have the wobbly forks in the bracket. I'm so glad that I didn't injure myself. It isn't until you are 30 years old when your thinking moves from the amygdala to your prefrontal cortex. Story 12. Not OSHA, but my father was a safety coordinator at Kennecott Copper Mine, and boy, I'll go in order of severity. First, there were times that he caught the crew out by the woods trying to feed apples to the deer. They had skewered the apples and were trying to reach as far over the fences as they could to coax them just a bit closer. Nobody fired. Next, he found some guys trying to break this gigantic bolt. He came across them right at the time that one was standing under this giant wrench to hold it in place, while another guy was climbing up onto some equipment and planned to jump onto the wrench. Genius, I know. 2 guys got fired that day. Then comes the story about the acid vat. During a shutdown, he came across some guys playing Jack Be Nimble with the opening of the acid vat. Needless to say, these vats, designed to process ores, were extremely dangerous. My father came across them doing this as one guy jumped and lost his shoe in the vat, instantly disintegrated. About 8 guys got fired that day, and the one had the balls to ask for a replacement for his shoe. Probably why my dad has high blood pressure nowadays. There are more, but those ones stood out the most in my mind. Story 13. Not OSHA, but I went to recycle copper wire and the company knew me on a first-name basis. They first asked if I'd stay and install a light fixture. When I hesitated, they asked if I could just find out if the circuit they wanted it installed on was live. Sure, would only require my ticker and the press of a button. Next thing you know, they asked their operator to boom me up to the warehouse ceiling on a forklift. Story 14. Not OSHA employee, but the 2 electricians changing the light bulbs of the streetlights in my hometown did it with one driving the van and the other standing on top of a ladder on its roof. Story 15. I do A's and watched a bunch of guys using a forklift to literally lift an entire box truck over a fence instead of just pushing it through the gate. They thought I was at lunch. I was not. Story 16. I don't work for OSHA, but I do work in a role where ensuring compliance with workplace health and safety and arbitrating on those matters were a major portion of my role. The worst issue I have ever seen has been a bus operator for a major metropolitan area direct their employees to drive buses which, due to the inclusion of a new safety barrier, did not possess a line of sight to the left-hand side mirror. This is in a left-hand side driving country. I filed a dispute, and after some argument, approximately 3 weeks of it, they came to the conclusion that there was a problem and made the right decision to withdraw them and install a new, less obstructed panel. Through this period, the operator was threatening to take disciplinary actions against drivers who refused to drive these buses, drivers who couldn't see the mirrors and posed a huge risk to the public. Story 17. Not an OSHA employee, truck driver instead. I don't see a lot of big rigs violating the safety laws since we get in huge trouble if we do, but I see stuff on Dualia pickups and box trucks all of the time. Last week, I saw a pickup with mattresses stacked almost as high as my trailer. It reminded me of this one time when I saw the front end of a Mustang completely smashed in from a mattress that had fallen on it on the freeway. Story 18. Not an OSHA worker. I work in a CSO and had to clean out one of our vortexes manually. It's a confined space, so I needed an attendant. After about an hour, I finished and came out to find nobody was around. Walked up to the office, and two of our guys were asking where I'd gone because my attendant went to take a crap 45 minutes before and was playing on his phone in the office. He said he told me to come out and figured I was ducking off somewhere. Should have lost his job then. Story 19. Intern at an OSHA equivalent org in Asia was at a site where they were building two housing blocks very close to each other. The blocks were up to 40 floors high. The main contractor installed proper bridges with handrails to link the two blocks every 10 floors. But the workers also placed thin, unsecured planks on every floor to link the blocks. The end of the plank on the top floor looked like it was less than 3 centimeters away from the edge. There were bare live wires randomly poking from the ceilings, workers climbing on scaffolding without helmets or harnesses, workers on 3M tall ladders and using them like stilts, rocking side to side to walk the ladder to the next light fixture, and the workers were housed on the site in the unfinished building. Their tower crane operator turned up and climbed up the crane in wife-beater, sarong, and flip-flops. His excuse was that the weather was really hot that day. That site was disastrous. My supervisor was shaking with anger by the end of the inspection. Story 20. I was at a steel mill in the middle of PA. One of the EES had gotten really good side pulling the ladle from the furnace, arcing it down a corridor, and placing it in the cooling area. All of the overhead cranes had just been modified from a pendant control to a wireless control. The EE stood at the top of the fulcrum, next to a railing of a cooling pit for another furnace. As the E swings the load, he is struck by the ladle and hit into the railing. He suffered several broken ribs, a broken back, and arm. His side pull did not go as planned. I've also investigated fatalities and a bunch of other stupid decisions that lead to bad injuries. Everyone needs to slow down and think about what you are doing, at work and at home. Bad habits follow you everywhere. Remember, stop work authority too. Be that guy or gal. If your company doesn't care that much, you don't want to work there. Story 21. I am not an OSHA employee, but have seen crapload of things happening in oil fields. Two biggest were when the electrical supervisor opened a live 4,160 volts ups and was studying the drawing. He dropped the drawing in the ups, reached inside the live panel, grab it, pull it out, and then continue reading the drawing while all of including his supervisor. We're standing next to him, and we're holding our breath that if we say anything while he's inside the panel, it can distract him and can have serious consequences. Later, when reprimanded, he was insisting that he did not do anything wrong. Second, employee opened the sample line and decided that was the ideal time to get some dinner. Afterwards, he forgot about it and went home. 8 hours and 200 BBLs later, people found out what happened. Story 22. Not an inspector, but did work comp insurance for a bit. I saw this on CCTV for Evidence Factory that made foam for mattresses had a machine that would cut up medium-sized chunks of foam into smaller ones to put into mattresses. Sort of like a wood chipper. One guy got tired of putting handfuls at a time, the recommended way, and decided to get a bucket and start shoveling into the cutter. When it got stuck from too much foam, he used the stick part of a broom to push it through. This got the broom stuck. He then decides to put both hands in to dislodge the stick and stuck foam. The machine was still on this whole time. He somehow manages to get the stick out, and the blades start going again. He amazingly only lost 2 fingertips and tried to sue his boss. We settled for $30,000. Story 23. I'm not an OSHA employee, but I worked at a convenience store that had a pizza place inside that made food for travelers and that locals could order. We had to make cookies, and we had about 6 kinds, 2 of which contained peanut butter. It was important to keep those 2 separates from the rest when making them because of how serious nut allergies can be. My manager put all the cooked into one tub to bring out. They were already pre-made in frozen discs. We just thawed and baked them, completely contaminating all the different kind of cookies with each other. I brought it to her attention, but she didn't care. Other violations when she was there, like leaving food in the way past its time just so she wouldn't have to make new stuff, and never dated any of the food in the fridge. She never cleaned up after herself either by wiping down counters. Story 24. My first job was for a large grocery chain, and the store's huge walk-in freezer wouldn't defrost. It was covered in sheets of ice and wasn't getting fixed. When I ate crap hard in there one day, twisting my arm and smacking my face, I marched my overly confident teen self over to the store manager and told him, as if he didn't already know, that the freezer floor was covered in ice and that I had fallen and hurt myself. He replied, verbatim, "Yeah, haha, it's like an ice skating rink in there." And then he walked away, which was dangerous. So I filed a complaint with OSHA, and investigators showed up the very next day. The store had to finally fix the freezer and no one else got hurt in there. Story 25. Owens Corning had a company-wide stand down that affected all their plants. The issue? Someone had disabled an interlock that prevented the door to a caged-in area for an automated robotic portion of the production system. A worker was crushed, cleaning agents were stowed in the area, and it seemed to have been used as stowage for a long time. not an OSHA employee. I was part of an engineering team that was modernizing the system at the time. This occurred about 15 years ago. Same company also had a tornado response of going outside in the event of a tornado warning. The muster area was also where millions of squares of shingles were stowed. There was perfectly adequate building inside a building called the restrooms and showers. Yeah, that pace was unreal. Story 26. Obligatory, not an OSHA inspector. But my job put in brand new 20-foot shelving units for holding pallets. They looked great and we really desperately needed the space to get pallets off the floor. Only one problem, they weren't bolted to anything. They also were not against a wall, so if they fell, it would almost certainly hurt or kill someone. They'd be bolted down in a week, my supervisor said. I was threatened with a write-up for insubordination because I refused to load a dozen pallets weighing over 200 pounds each on this shelf. I told them I had already taken a video showing that no shelves were bolted down while my coworker loaded them and they could kiss my ass. They did not kiss my ass, but they did not write me up either. Story 27. Security tasked with ensuring AS compliance here. The absolute worst has to be this one department on my post, chemical processing and storage facility. Going in there when they have agitator motors running on drums and venting the exhaust right into the room will physically make you sick. I once had an extremely painful sore throat for a week after one 60-second exposure. Yet not a single person who works in there regularly wears even a dust mask, let alone a respirator. Elsewhere in the facility, people have Allegro hoods being fetted too, good respirators, etc., but not in this one area where it seems to be the worst. Other than that, fire extinguishers with blacked out gauges, lights starting fires because they're so covered with cobwebs, PPE is essentially optional. Yeah, good times. Story 28. Not an OSHA employee, but an HVAC specialist. Once saw a foreman tie a rope around a 100-pound gooseneck elbow, secure the rope with a pair of vice grips, and then pull it up about 50 meters onto the roof of a building. Story 29. Military safety guy here. We have a building on base with a ceiling that leaks and basement that floods when it rains. The coolest part is that there are unshielded wires and comm boxes laying in the parts of the basement where water pools. We also have the emergency phone lines for the fire department for the nearest large civilian passenger airport right next door running through that basement. So, everyone, if we get water in those, you didn't need the fire department anyway. It has been 2 years since I reported that building. The responses I got then were, it has always been like that. Also, we're still waiting for bids for the repair. OSHA doesn't cover the military. Story 30. When I first started working at my current workplace, I used to smoke and I had to go to a designated shelter, which was right next to a large pressurized oxygen tank. On a number of occasions, I saw employees actually smoking right next to the tank itself, for some reason deciding that they didn't want to be in the shelter. What people don't seem to realize is that, yes, oxygen is good for breathing, but that goes doubly so for fire. If that tank sprang a leak and someone lit up nearby, their ordinarily not so flammable clothes and flesh would suddenly be very flammable indeed. In the end, they moved the shelter after a couple years to be at least 200 yards from any building. Story 31. Not an OSHA inspector, but I did hear about some safety-related accidents from my friend. A 19-year-old employee was cleaning out a silo with a vac truck and got fatally electrocuted. There was enough static generated from the friction between the air and the wall of a 100-pound hose to stop his heart. All because the other operator said he didn't need to ground the hose because he'd done this 100 times. Another time for a hydroelectric power plant, some guy had literally gotten cooked with a ton of voltage when someone forgot to tag out something. My friend said we'll never forget the smell of burning flesh. Story 32. Not OSHA, but one summer in college, I worked in construction. We had to hang some stucco board on the side of a building. It was probably 60 pounds tall at its highest. At the bottom was a sort of drainage ditch. We had to build scaffolding to get to the top. Of course, the drainage ditch isn't level, so our boss found some flat rocks, stacked 2 or 3 of them, and then we continued to build the scaffolding. We worked at the top of that thing with heavy-ass 12-pound stucco boards on scaffolding that was balancing on a couple of rocks stacked up. Hindsight, I can't believe that scaffolding held up over 2 full days. Story 33. I'm OSHA certified since our store needs so many employees certified. We have a magnetically sealing door that leads to a trash compactor. The door is broken so it won't stay open. So instead they use a broken-ass bungee cord to hold the door. The one window is taped up because someone thought it would look better. They lost the key to the door, so the only way to keep it open is to wedge a piece of cardboard in the hole so it won't seal. And it doesn't open from the other side for some odd reason. When I have to had it to put one foot in the door and toss my trash. Story 34. I once found a cabinet with random vials of cyanide laying around. Another time I found an asbestos enclosure where the enclosure had failed, and it had been without negative pressure for 2 days. This was in a very busy federal building. I know of one agency that routinely sends its employees into high-pressure steam tunnels without any kind of confined space training or rescue apparatus. I saw one of the carry-on scanners the TSA uses, 480 volts, with exposed wiring directly adjacent to carpet passengers. I know of a popular online retailer that underreports its recordable and lost time rates by writing an essay on why the injuries don't count for every single injury. Story 35? Not an OSHA employee, but these guys I worked with were undermining a road. Cars were still passing over the dug area. No efforts were made to secure the trench boxes or such. No ladders. A 6-foot pile of the trench spoils were right on the edge. Phone, gas, and power ran nearby. But locates weren't done. I'm honestly surprised it didn't collapse. The cars driving overhead shook loose plenty of gravel from the sides of the hole. Story 36. I worked for the USAF, and I usually made people run safety equipment like eye washes rather than relying on the inspection cards not being pencil whipped. One time in Texas, they hit the foot handle for an eye wash and water trickled out. Then a swarm of fire ants came out with the water. I couldn't even get angry, and they're pencil whipping the inspection card, because all I could think of was some poor git getting degreaser in his eyes and running to the eye wash to get his face full of fire ants. It was literally the scene from a cartoon waiting to happen. Story 37. Actual real-life OSHA inspector here. Most gnarly case I had was when a father-son team was doing field service work on the hydraulic piston of a mobile crane. The piston cylinder casing failed due to a combination of overpressurization and metal stress fatigue. Opened up an 11 inches fracture on the piston, releasing pressurized hydraulic fluid directly into the torso of the father, who was standing on the crane deck next to the piston. The pressurized fluid jet cut his torso in two from roughly his left collarbone to the bottom of his right rib cage. The son was on the ground and watched it happen. Story 38. I work in construction, and when on site, I heard our O's person had to leave to write up a violation. Someone decided to send one of the young blokes down a drain pipe on a skateboard to clear a blockage on a pipe. The line was 80 meters long and a 450 millimeter dia pipe. It was also storm season. Apparently, they used the skateboard so if he passed out, they could pull him back, or words to that effect. Story 39. Not OSHA, but I did report it as a safety violation. A crew of painters were doing their job in my office, painting the walls, top to bottom, 15-foot ceilings. One of them finished the section he could reach from where he was and started scooching the ladder over to the next section without getting off of it, while he was still 8 feet up the ladder. I shut that down immediately and called his boss. Painters were not happy with mean supervisor lady, but no one fell off a ladder and hit their head in my office that day. Story 40. While working on a small pipeline project, one guy had a 6-pack of beer under the back seat of his truck. Obviously, the beer was warm. We figured we could cool the cans by tipping a propane bottle upside down and spraying them with liquid propane. I guess there is a safety device to prevent this, so we put a hose on the tank and cut the hose. One guy held the cans with his bare hands in the stream of liquid propane on the work site. Good times. Story 41. Not an OSHA employee, but I saw some finisher guys on the 19th floor of a large commercial site duct tape, an electric grinder, and cable and all to a 3 meters long piece of wood to grind off some crap at the back of area where the air vents were to be installed. Safety Comedy was walking site that day and shut that down really quick. The guy doing it was upset that the comedy wouldn't allow his genius engineering. Story 42. I'm not an OSHA employee. One time in a resume, I saw on of those biohazard containers for used needles, full and wide open without the safety lid on. The container was on a low chair up against a wall. There were kids running around. There were no employees in sight. I reported it. Story 43. I was the new safety guy for a metal shop that would send out a can of aerosol adhesive, flammable, with some products. For some reason, they had someone peeling the label off of the can and applying a new one. The guy was using a heat gun to remove the labels. He said he didn't think it was safe, but one of the other guys told him that they always did it that way. I've seen some crazy and dangerous practices, but this stands out for the absurd lack of common sense. Story 44. Maintenance guy was changing the bulbs in one of our overhead light fixtures in the warehouse. Goes up in the scissor lift with the new bulbs and somehow makes contact with the live part of the fixture with his bare hands. He's shocked pretty good. Even his belt buckle flew open because of the surge. He apparently squealed like a stuck pig. Somehow manages to hit the lever to lower the lift and stumbles off of the platform. He never went to the hospital and said his arm tingled for a few weeks. Story 45. My teacher tells a story of an employee hosing down a 3-phase outlet with a water hose and getting badly shocked. He copped all the blame as he was not following the safe work method statement. Story 46. Not an OSHA employee, but my company has to follow strict OSHA standards due to the chemicals and oils we use. Anyway, about a year ago, some dude was hiding, smoking a cigarette. The big issue was, he was literally sitting on an acetylene tank turned upside, which was directly next to our welding supply cage, which had 11 other full acetylene tanks in them. That was his farewell cigarette. Story 47. Not OSHA, but I worked for a year in a small plastic molding plant. Saw a guy surf a bale of scrap plastic as it ejected onto the pallet. To be fair, it wasn't on purpose. The bale wasn't coming out, so he climbed behind it, so his body was between the back wall and a 1,500-pound bale to push it out from the back. It worked, but he held on to the bale and rode it on the way out. Story 48. Obligatory, not OSHA, but I go to a lot of sketchy body shops all day, so I see some unsafe practices. I have two. Once saw a guy using an angle grinder to cut metal. He wasn't wearing any eye protection, and the sparks were flying straight into his face. He wasn't even looking away. I also once saw a guy using a MIG welder with no welding helmet, staring straight at what he was working on. Bonus points because he was smoking a cigarette. Story 49. It wasn't related to my workplace, which is extremely strict with OSHA, but work I needed to have work done in my yard and knew the violations because of my job. Hurricane Florence knocked a tree over in my yard. The contractors who ended up coming out to remove it didn't use any safety equipment at all, and, while wielding a chainsaw, stood on a bobcat with a forklift attachment to get a better reach, being raised up at least 10 feet in the air. Story 50. One of my college instructors showed us a picture he took of a scissor lift on an angled rooftop, with it fully raised, the basket fully extended, doing repairs on the building. The roof in the picture did not look sturdy whatsoever, and it looked like the slightest breeze would topple the thing. He doesn't even know how they got the lift on the roof to begin with, since the only machinery that place has were forklifts, and the one scissor lift. Story 51. Not an OSHA employee, but our lab facilities manager said she never had trouble finding safety violations. A grad student would come around a corner and see her walking towards them and quickly turn around and speed walk away. She'd make a note to check that lab, and sure enough, someone would be doing something dumb. Story 52. Not an OSHA inspector, but I work for a company that manufactures electrical equipment that prevents explosions in hazardous environments like an oil rig or refinery. I've seen electrical enclosures that are designed with very small tolerances for error, that have only had 4 bolts holding the cover on when 20 are required. Even one missing bolt can lead to catastrophic explosion. We're talking the risk of major loss of life just to save a few minutes of time. Story 53, not OSHA, but I spent some time as a safety supervisor. I took a lunch break one time only to come back to my fellow safety men filling out a report, because some kid operating a crane decided to not check the porta potty he was moving. Dude was inside the porta potty and was picked up and moved by a crane while taking a crap. Was quite the messy situation, but everyone got out okay. Story 54. Not sure if it's exactly an OSHA violation, but I worked as a security guard out of high school for a high-security warehouse, stored toxic, flammable, and otherwise dangerous containers. And one night, a driver fell asleep while bringing his load in and flattened our plywood guard shack, turned the truck on its side, and dumped a bunch of oxygen tanks into the countryside. Nobody got hurt, though. Story 55. I'm no OSHA employee, and far from it. But my local junkyard has their draining lift made out of steel shelving with 3 legs. The 4th leg is a piece of wood, sitting tall ways with a bottle jack on top of it. They have it covered with a tarp, so it's safer or something. A good friend of mine worked under it for a number of months. Story 56. I didn't see it, however, and coworker at a manufacturing company I worked for passed away due to being sucked into a machine, think really big vacuum cleaner hose, due to lack of safety standards. OSHA was less than happy about it. Story 57. Non-OSHA here. Visited my brother's building to give him something. Noticed that there are no stairs or bright green signs for an emergency exit. This is the 17th floor. My brother also told me that there were instances of the elevator breaking down and trapping people in the building until the elevator got fixed. Safe to say, I never visited a second time. Story 58. I wish OSHA would come to my local USPS facility, but only sort of. They'd shut it down after just a few hours, no doubt. Some forklift, tug operators zooming by in the halls at 25 miles an hour when they're not supposed to go more than walking speed. Also just the general unsafe nature of equipment. Story 59. Was an intern at a company before I had any OSHA knowledge. Was thrown into being an attendant for someone who went down into a distillation column without fall protection. The company suffered a dust explosion at a different facility a few years later. Dodged a bullet getting out of there. Story 60. Worked for a micro center that way, overstocked its warehouse without good options for navigating the mess. We'd have to regularly climb on, through, and around loose pallets and gaylords, as well as boulder about 15 feet of shelving. Hard drives dropped on heads, thankfully packaged, were really common. Lucky it wasn't more often worse. Story 61. When I was in the Army, I was once manning the CQ desk at like 3 a.m. and was bored. So I read the posted signs, including the OSHA one asking me to report unsafe work environment. I briefly wondered if that meant people shooting at me in combat. Story 62. I once saw my country's version of OSHA driving in their car, technically their workplace, and talking on their phone, illegal here while driving. The irony made me laugh out loud for real. Story 63. I opened a fire escape door once, and someone had removed the staircase from the other side, so the door just opened into thin air with a 20-foot drop on the other side. It was like something out of an Acme cartoon. Story 64. I'm not an OSHA employee, but at one point while I was working at a skating rink, I ended up walking, standing on it and rocking it to get it to walk, a ladder across the skate floor while wearing roller skates. I'm not sure what regulations that broke, but probably several. Story 65. Watch 8 tons of pipe fall from about 20 meters because someone was in a rush and used the incorrect rigging. The kicker is everyone there, 30 people, were totally willing to let it go unreported. Except me. I never really did make too many friends after that. Oh well. Story 66. I work in construction and have seen some gut-wrenching safety violations. Too many to count. I once saw a man walking across a brace cutting the unwanted remainder on support beams off with a chainsaw while 60 feet high and no safety harness. Story 67. Using a Wiggins forklift to lift a board just to place a ladder on that board and replace pennants on a maritime flagpole. 2 people on the ladder, 1 person on the board feeding pennants to the people on the ladder. Owner of the organization was directing. Story 68. My old boss had us spray out trailers hauling cattle with sulfuric acid to sterilize them, all without using PPE or respirators. Cheap Duck wouldn't even buy us gloves until I had to take a month off work due to chemical burns to my right arm. Story 69. Not an OSHA employee, but there was a medical waste disposal facility in northern Viet that had tractor trailers leaking blood and other liquids in the parking lot. An employee fell into a pallet-sized container of used needles and was punctured hundreds of times. Story 70. Not an OSHA employee, but I do have an interest in health and safety. OSHA employees. How did you get into this field? I have an HR degree and work in staffing. Thoughts? Story 71. OSHA don't give a duck. If you report something, they call your employer to tell them they are coming to check on that exact issue in like 2 months. Kind of needed the respirators and forced air ventilation, I don't know. Right now. Story 72. They may not be involved about this. When I used to work at Walmart, they used to block fire exits. They probably still do it. Yet I don't think OSHA does anything about that. Story 73. I heard that in some molding companies, they have the workers jump into the mold to remove the part and replace the pins before the top mold come down and takes the next shot. Needless to say, the molds weigh several tons. Story 74. A window washing rig didn't reach the top of the roof, so the window washer had the bright idea of climbing onto the rails of his rig, grabbing the edge of the roof and pulling himself up and over the edge.